Donald Trump is officially withdrawing from negotiations to end Russia's war against Ukraine, as he is meeting with dictator Putin in Alaska. And absolutely empty threats achieve nothing, so he simply washes his hands of it. But the White House stated that no, it's not Donald Trump and his failed strategy to blame, but Europe is at fault for everything. As the publication Axios writes, high-ranking White House officials believe that some European leaders publicly support the efforts of President Donald Trump to end the war in Ukraine. However, in reality, they are secretly and cunningly trying to undermine the progress that was achieved behind the scenes after the Putin-Trump summit in Alaska. They say that Trump almost stopped the war, but the bad Europeans ruined everything. Importantly, Axios isn't the only one covering this. An article with similar insider information appeared in The Atlantic on Thursday. Earlier, The Guardian reported the same scenario of Trump leaving negotiations and said all blame would fall on the Europeans. Well, and Reuters wrote that the Americans were hoping to simply abandon Ukraine and start doing business with the Russians. Now, Trump has found a whole bunch of reasons why it's Europe that's to blame for everything and why no negotiations took place. And Trump simply doesn't want to admit that the meeting with Putin in Alaska was absolutely unnecessary, and that's why he slams the door in frustration and points at the Europeans. My name is Alexei Pechi. Today is August 30th. Let's figure out this story together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video, so as they say, here we go. Axios reports that White House officials privately think Europe is hurting negotiation efforts, and that very so-called progress, which was breathlessly talked about after the meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska. And this isn't just the opinion of Axios. The Atlantic came out with the same thesis on Thursday. They say the main obstacle in the negotiations isn't in Washington or Moscow, but somewhere between Brussels and the major capitals of the European Union. The problem, as usual, is that when there's no result, it's easier to find someone to blame than to find a solution. Trump says that I've already made all the decisions, but Europe keeps insisting on its security guarantees for Ukraine. And now Andriy Yermak, the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, came to a meeting with Steve Witkoff and refused to give Donbas to the Russians. So, it's all the Europeans and Ukrainians' fault. Let's go through it point by point. The picture painted by the Axios source is as follows. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Trump's aides blame everything on the Europeans. The blame should fall on the allies. This is their idea fix and seems like an attempt to shift responsibility from Trump and even Putin. The same sources claim that European leaders are allegedly pushing Kyiv toward unrealistic territorial concessions. And let's pause here for a second. Ukraine, let me remind you, is not demanding any concessions from itself to Russia. Kyiv consistently insists on a ceasefire along the current front line without recognizing the occupation and without any so-called gift referendums for the Kremlin. And this is a position, not some fantasy. And it didn't just appear yesterday. Ukraine has held this position since Donald Trump's 2024 campaign, when he claimed he would end the war in 24 hours. And exactly the same idea, but from a different angle. A ceasefire first, and then everything else was exactly what Donald Trump himself was expressing back at the beginning of spring. Later, though, he changed his tune, met with Putin, and started talking completely differently. It gets even more interesting from here. Those same irritated White House officials, according to Axios, are losing patience with the Europeans and at the same time are putting forward a list of demands. Cut off Russian oil and gas entirely and impose secondary tariffs on India and China, as the United States did. So basically, the Americans are telling the Europeans to hit Russian energy. And this is where, a kind of mental gymnastics begins. Reuters wrote this week that inside Washington, yes, pay attention, they were actually considering the idea of possibly returning some Russian energy supplies to Europe as a tool to put pressure on prices. But it was Europe that took a tough stance and is sticking to the course of completely giving up Russian gas by 2027. But once again, the Americans are now insisting that it's Europe that doesn't want to give up Russian gas. And it's the Americans who are demanding tariffs against India and China, even though they themselves have basically not done this. Want to hear another interesting detail? The United States doesn't exactly support Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil infrastructure. It's actually quite the opposite. Remember Donald Trump's response to Viktor Orban's letter, where he took a very cautious stance when Orban complained to Trump that the Ukrainians had struck the Druzhba oil pipeline, and Trump replied, "I'm very angry." However, when the results of these strikes on oil refineries in Russia appeared, American officials, represented by the United States ambassador to NATO, Matt Whitaker, suddenly stated that it was the United States of America that helped the armed forces of Ukraine so successfully destroy Russian oil refineries. If you didn't know, as Whitaker stated today, it turns out that it's the Americans who are giving the Ukrainians the ability to strike from such a distance. Unfortunately, no. Or fortunately. But it's Ukrainian drones and Ukrainian missiles that are flying toward Russian oil refineries. What's hypocritical is that the United States isn't giving weapons to Ukraine directly. They're just selling them to Europeans who then send them to Ukraine. So, accusing Europe of being soft while at the same time playing this so-called flexible geoenergy game and holding back strikes on Russia's oil industry? Well, at least it's selective. The second flaw in the logic is those same secondary tariffs. So, let me remind you, Brussels is already discussing in its 19th package of sanctions mechanisms to put pressure not only on supplies from the Russian Federation, but also on bypass routes through third countries. This is right now on the table in the European Union. Yes, of course, the United States has its own tools. This is a tariff pressure on Indian and Chinese supplies, dollar leverage, etc. But as strange as it may sound, it's not up to the United States of America to tell Europe which lever it should pull and when. Here's a simple fact. When it comes to Russia's shadow fleet, it's Europe and Britain that have gone into turbo mode this year. Hundreds of tankers and intermediaries are being blacklisted. And the new insurance and inspection rules are depriving those very dark ships of their usual loopholes. Trump personally introduced exactly 0 new sanctions against this scheme of Putin's shadow fleet. And that's also a fact, no matter how much one would like to claim some victories. Now, about the rhetoric. An anonymous high-ranking official from the White House, quoted by Axios, came up with a real masterpiece. Quote, "Europeans cannot continue this war and harbor unrealistic expectations, expecting the United States to bear all the costs. If Europe wants to escalate, that's their business. But they will hopelessly snatch defeat from the jaws of victory." This is an analysis, it's just an emotional note from an office where they read the news only by the headlines. Because this phrase, snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, is a figure of speech. But payments, air defense supplies, training, industrial mobilization, this is the reality that Europe is actually investing in. Unlike the Americans, it's the Europeans who are now financing absolutely all arms supplies to Ukraine. It's the Europeans who are buying new Patriot air defense systems from the Americans and transferring them to Ukraine. Europeans have taken on the responsibility of training the armed forces of Ukraine in Europe. It's the Europeans who are now restarting their defense industry in order to keep up with supplying everything necessary for the armed forces of Ukraine. So to say that Europe is snatching defeat from the jaws of victory, well, that's just cynicism. And by the way, The Atlantic notes the same trend and writes that the White House publicly calls for unity, but privately scolds its allies to lower expectations. Trump's inner circle, according to Axios, is convinced that the Europeans are pushing Zelensky to wait for a better deal. Maximalism, which allegedly only expanded this war. Let me remind you, recently Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, was asked how Washington is responding to the Russian attack on Kyiv. On the night of August 28, when 23 people were killed, including 4 children, she stated, "Well, what did you expect? This is the response of the unwashed Russians to the Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil refineries." I don't know what happened to the logic in the White House, but to say that the aggressor is striking back in response to the victims' attacks, that's a kind of logic that simply doesn't exist. And again, I want to ask like an adult here, who dragged out this formula for a whole year? saying that Patriots are for defense and long-range missiles are for strikes on Russia. Let's see. Who spent months arguing about whether it's possible to strike targets on the territory of the Russian Federation, and who was losing the pace of weapon supplies. Exactly at those moments, when determination was needed at the front and when it was possible to survive and drive the Russians out very quickly. When the White House says we pay more than anyone else, that's financially true. When they pretend that everyone else is lazy, that's just a convenient story to justify Donald Trump. The American stance in the leaks becomes even clearer later. We'll sit and watch, let them fight a little, and we'll see what happens next. You know, it sounds nice if you ignore the number of Ukrainians killed, but peacemaking doesn't work by just sitting and watching. Trump said he would stop all wars, but if you just sit and watch, you won't stop anything. The Guardian just last week wrote about a scenario where Trump is ready to step back from active diplomacy while continuing to sell weapons to Kiev. This might not be the worst scenario. It's still better than forcing Ukraine to concede. But the White House should honestly say that they won't start talking about any kind of deal of the century until Moscow stops striking cities and the balance on the battlefield changes. But as it is, you know, Trump made a lot of statements, a lot of threats, a lot of deadlines and so on, but didn't do anything. Absolutely nothing. In fact, if you take all of Trump's statements and put them on one side of the scale and on the other side put his actions, it's zero. Exactly zero. Well, if not even a negative effect, considering his meeting with the dictator Putin. Now Trump is shifting all the blame onto Europe, saying, listen, I threatened, of course, but what did he threaten with? Trump threatened with secondary tariffs against India and China. Trump threatened, Trump didn't impose the tariffs. Europe is to blame. Trump gave Putin 10 days to stop the war. Otherwise, the White House's tactics would change and there would be decisive actions. Nothing happened. Is Europe to blame? In short, Europe is to blame for everything. And by the way, let me remind you, it was Putin who said in Alaska that the main thing was for the Europeans not to ruin all the agreements with Trump. Now, Trump echoes Putin saying, yes, the Europeans ruined everything. One more important detail. That very meeting between Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, Yermak, which Axios wrote about, took place without significant progress. Excuse me, but what kind of progress were they expecting there anyway? Did they expect Witkoff to convince Yermak to just give up Donbas for the sake of a nice press release? Kyiv has been clearly articulating its position for months. A ceasefire along the current front line, security guarantees not just on paper but legally binding, restoration of air defense, prolonged sanctions pressure on Russia's economy, and strict control over bypass schemes. This isn't an ultimatum, it's the minimum set of requirements to make sure the pause doesn't turn into preparation for the next strike on Kharkiv or Odessa. Now, about energy, as a matter of principle, in Washington they like to pretend that it was their idea to cut off the Kremlin's oxygen. If we look at the facts, Europe is moving toward 2027 without Russian gas and oil and is reducing supplies along all routes, from pipelines to grey blends. When the European Union lowers the price cap on Russian oil to $47.5 per barrel, you know, that's not a post on social media X like Trump likes to do. It's a regulatory act enforced by inspections, insurers, ports, and criminal cases if needed. And that's exactly why Moscow is so nervously assembling that shadow fleet and why these ships are being massively banned from docking and repairs in European ports. That's what stops them, not Donald Trump's threats. Reuters, by the way, described in detail how Washington was simultaneously considering the option of targeted unfreezing of flows to stabilize the market. And again, this doesn't make Europe weak, it makes it consistent. Sanctions should be effective if imposed. The Americans say let's unfreeze a little, let Putin use the shadow fleet a bit, stabilize the market a little, and then close it again. Like that, just temporarily, just for a while, let it work. The United States is making itself look very bad here. Now, about their favorite tactic. Who exactly among the Europeans is interfering with Donald Trump? Let's figure this out. The leaks say that the British and the French are more constructive, while the others want to shift the costs onto the United States. The question is, name the names, show the budgets, show the arms packages, show the delivery rates to Ukraine. Who is it? Germany, Poland, the Scandinavians, the Baltic countries? Who's stopping you? Just say it clearly, because without specifics, it's very much like a smoke grenade thrown into the room so that no one can see that there really isn't a real deal with the Kremlin. Because the Kremlin isn't interested in ending the war without geopolitical bonuses, and Trump can't give them. Because Ukraine isn't going to just give up its territories. And that's why they can say that it's the Europeans who are to blame for everything. Name specifically who? Well, if it's really the Europeans who are disrupting the peace agreement, why not come out and publicly say, listen, these specific people are to blame. They're the ones doing something that's preventing us from reaching a peace agreement. Otherwise, it's just a smokescreen. And finally, the moral matrix, when in anonymous quotes you hear things like, if Europe wants to escalate, that's their business. Friends, this is an attempt to shift the responsibility for Russian attacks onto the victim. Listen closely. American officials from the White House, from Donald Trump's team, are saying that it's Europe that's escalating the war. Well, apparently Trump's team is convinced that it's the Europeans who are launching hundreds and hundreds of Shaheds at Ukrainian cities with their own hands. Today, Russia again launched drones and missiles, resulting in more deaths. The Americans say the Europeans are escalating the war. Let's sit and watch. As White House officials say, this is not a strategy, it's a way to shift responsibility for failed expectations of the so-called breakthrough after the meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska. Let's summarize everything in a brief conclusion. There are 3 lines. The first line is the White House's media line. Publicly, of course, it's unity with the entire West. Privately, there's irritation and a search for someone to blame. That's it. So you don't think these are just some conspiracy theories? Both Axios and The Atlantic are writing exactly about this, and they even agree in tone and details. The second line is the European line. Sanctions, the price cap on Russian oil, the move to abandon hydrocarbons from the Russian Federation by 1927, expanding control over the shadow fleet, and so on. This reality is confirmed by reports and leaks that are basically already becoming public. The third is the Ukrainian line, a ceasefire along the current front line without legalizing the occupation, without any fantasies about voluntary territorial concessions. Everything is consistent here, and there's nothing mysterious about the fact that Yermak didn't bring a breakthrough. The conclusion is simple and unpleasant. If any progress after Alaska really existed, it turned out to be too fragile to survive even a single week of news cycles. Is Europe to blame for this? No, of course not. The blame is on the war, which the Kremlin refuses to end realistically. The White House must either admit it's pursuing a long, exhausting pressure campaign or keep focusing on Brussels. You know, an easy mirror to blame everything on? In our position, the choice is obvious. Fewer myths about bad Europeans, more systematic support for Ukraine, and tougher action against shadow schemes. None of this, let's sit and watch religion, and as soon as we start acting according to this logic, you know, the damned progress after Alaska, progress in quotes, will stop being a rumor from the hallway and will become a line in the report. Regarding the sources, I include them in the text so it's clear. If multiple sources mention something, it's considered true. Axios discusses the White House's internal operations and post-Alaska negotiations. The Atlantic critiques Europe's role in similar matters, and Reuters reports on energy changes. Americans who say, let's temporarily lift sanctions on the Russians, the European Union's refusal by 2027, and American hesitations regarding gas. The Guardian discusses Trump possibly moving away from diplomacy but still supporting supplies to Ukraine. That's more than enough to not pretend as if the whole problem is in Europe. The issue lies with the Kremlin, dictator Putin, whom Donald Trump embraced, and Trump's unwillingness to accurately name the situation. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's it for now. Take care. Bye everyone.